The temperature is nice and warm in the Boiling Point Podcast studio, so come on in, get cozy, and let's enjoy the conversation. We empower leaders through thoughtful discussions to positively impact our world. Our host, Dave Vale, founder and CEO of Vision Coaching, Inc., is highlighting how we can thrive in business communities. Our conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, and inspirational storytellers are shining a spotlight on empowerment. Joining Dave this week is our special guest host, Emily Roger. Let's join the conversation with Dave and Emily.
Okay, it's official. We're here. Emily, good to see you again.
Hey, Dave. You too.
And you did something pretty remarkable this last weekend, which is you didn't run just a marathon, you ran an ultra marathon.
I did. Yeah.
And I think I've shared with you, I ran one marathon and said, I got that on my bucket list. I couldn't imagine running I don't think I could have run 26.3? Is it 26.2 as a marathon? Is that right?
Yeah, I ran there. Yep.
When I got, I was done. So to then just think you're halfway through at that point of an ultra marathon, I just can't even imagine. So, and I did see the video of you ending, and it must have been on LinkedIn, I guess.
Yeah.
Probably a whole bunch of platforms, but I saw it on LinkedIn. And what I was struck by, Emily, was you looked like you're smiling, like you didn't I kind of expected you to be collapsing across the line, but you weren't. So what was that experience like? Like what? Because you've been injured, you've been supporting others through their ultra marathons, and then you did it, and it was interesting. You also put a post out prior to in something you don't usually do.
Yeah, in telling people that I was going to attempt it, and recognizing how so often myself and probably others wait until we have accomplished something in order to then share it. And just what that was about was that a fear of me not being able to do it, or me not being able to, battling injury, not even knowing I could have gotten 5K in and had to pull out. But it was the most rewarding and just fulfilling day I've had in a really long time of running 80 kilometers. It was about 4,000 meters of elevation in the woods. And most of that just by myself and feeling so good. And it's the first time I've pinned down a race number in over 3 years, as you know, and it just sparked this thing again, this passion again, inside of me for doing events like that, because it's in those moments that I think that you really get to tap into what your strengths are, and just knowing that there's going to be highs and lows along the way, and you don't know when they're going to come, and just staying present and kind of breaking up that full 14-hour race into just little chapters. And between kilometer 0 and 45, I felt amazing, to the point that I'm something is not right. It should not feel this good. It felt so good. It just felt effortless. And then 45 to 55, I was oh, my hips are getting tight. My body's hurting a little bit. Can feel some blisters. Energy was still phenomenal. 55 to 65, I'm okay, more pain. This is getting tough. I know my feet are blistered. And then at the kilometer 68, I had to stop at the medic tent and get my feet bandaged. And it was almost just kind of visually seeing of oh, wow, I am in rough shape. And it was almost like something switched in my brain that went from feeling capable to then physically seeing injuries and thinking oh no, I can't do this. And, I did it. I pushed through. That last 12 kilometers was so hard, so painful, but still it was the coolest day. It was so pretty. It was in Bromont, Quebec. The colors were phenomenal. Everything about that race venue was amazing. My coach was there, and just being able to cross that finish line. And it's just I did it. That entire race, I think that it's it wasn't the finish line that was a celebration. It was even just getting to that start line. And that whole race is a celebration of 9 months of training and not knowing what the outcome is going to be. But the outcome was making it across the finish line. So incredible. It was pretty awesome.
Well, congratulations. And I love how you describe in chapters and the highs and the lows, and it almost like it mirrors life, doesn't it? Like
big time.
Is the way you're describing, I'm like, that's life, like that's, but in a shorter version, clearly.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, thinking of like, oh, I'm because that was my first one and I haven't done that before yet. Yeah. Thinking it of as my entire life has been an ultra marathon and I still feel like I'm running it. Like even this week, I'm like, okay, now I'm on lap 2.
Yeah. We were talking beforehand about, life and all the ups and downs and the highs and lows. And so I just love how you described it, the ultra marathon kind of emulating or mirroring life. Before we're going to bring our guest in here in a second, but I want to ask you one more question. So tell me about now having completed and being successful, not that should make any difference, but how do you feel about, that post ahead of time? Like, how are you feeling about it now? Sending that, letting people know and really, I guess, changing things up for yourself, right? Where you typically would do it post, you did it pre.
Yeah.
How do you, what's the thinking now about that decision?
Yeah, I think it was, almost like a way of me accepting for myself that it's okay if it doesn't happen or not. And it's like almost that expectation that I put on myself that maybe is not even so much of put on that I feel it's put on from other people, but the expectation that's putting it on myself and even putting it out there again that I'm racing another one in less than 5 weeks and not knowing what that's going to be like. It could be a totally different outcome from what this one is, but it's just a matter of just keep putting ourselves out there and we're not going to we're never going to cross the finish line if we don't make it to the start.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. And why make it a secret, right?
Yeah.
It's so just, and I had talked, and I'm talking about this one marathon, but just it was a big event for me because it was something I thought about for years. I did all these half marathons. I finally did it, but interestingly, what I did was the only way I got through it, and for me it was nothing like you've experienced, but it was a challenge in itself. For me it was a big challenge because I didn't realize how much harder it was. I didn't realize how much more you should train than when I hit the wall kind of at mile 22. But what really put me through it was the fact that I put it out in a newsletter 6 months before. I said, I've been talking about this forever. And I asked clients to make commitments and declarations. And I realized I've been hiding from this. And I'm telling you right now, I'm going to do this. And it was because I did that actually I followed through on it. So it was interesting because it wasn't something I was going to do post, because I wouldn't have done it because it just was, I found it so excruciating. So I want to bring our guest in and it's interesting we're talking about running because I was driving last night. I was driving my son to a hockey game and this guy comes running up almost, and my son was driving. He's just learning to drive. And I said, "Oh, be careful. You don't want to hit. That's Mark Legier. He's going to be on the podcast tomorrow. I don't want you to hit him." And he was running up along the Kennebecasis River, Mark. And I've seen you running out in the valley a few times. I think you're dropping kids off at sporting events. You're a big runner. Welcome to the Boiling Point. I know we've talked about having you on here for years. We were finally able to get your agent to agree to it. So we want to welcome you, Mark Legier.
Thank you. Mark. Hi, nice to meet you. And I got to say, Emily, I'm a fan. Dave, there's I think it's best to describe it as a social media app for runners and bikers and swimmers, triathletes called Strava. I'm not sure if you're on it or you've been on it before, but I'm on it and I follow Emily.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
What's the app called for people that are interested?
It's called Strava. And it's great. It's picture it. It's the best way to describe it is it's like social media for triathletes and runners and bikers, where you record all your runs and share pictures, and you can in the same way that you'd on Twitter or Instagram. And so I've followed Emily now. I'm not sure for how long, Emily, about a year. So I was stunned by the 80K race. Because Dave, when you saw me, I think it was last night, was it?
Yeah, it was last night.
Yeah, I was on a mere 16K run, Emily, not 80.
16K is still a big run. And it's, I actually, I didn't even know what ultra marathons were until about a year ago. And a friend of mine who I know through the fly fishing community had done one. And I thought, well, that looks really cool. And I used to run a lot when I was racing triathlon, but nothing on trail. And then my athletic career shifted to cycling. So after seeing this person's post, I went out and did a trail run and I got 4K in and I was like, oh yeah, no, I'm done. And I'm like, I don't think I'm going to be cut out for an ultra, but that was like, now 9 months ago. So it's, but 16K is still a hard run.
But isn't that amazing about social media, how people can have a sense of each other and have not met? And, like I know people have followed you in fly fishing, Emily, and then for you, Mark, you're, I want to talk a little bit about your role right now with Huddle. And, I love getting, and you don't do them, I think you're doing them less frequently, but you get these great messages you send out on Saturdays, kind of a bit of an editorial almost. And, but let our audience know about, who you are outside of being the 16K runner. And I know you've done marathons as well. But what you do and as how you make your money and what your passion is.
For sure, yeah. No, and Dave, I think we need to get inspired too, because I've actually run 12 marathons, and when I see 80, Emily, it's like I just got to get to the start line. That's what I'm going to keep saying to myself.
That's right.
To do that 80.
Yeah, I knew you had done it. That's amazing. That's impressive. Wow. So tell listeners a little bit about you.
Yeah, so right now I'm the director of news content for Acadia Broadcasting and also for Huddle. And I've been with Huddle itself since around early 2017. And Huddle was subsequently acquired by Acadia Broadcasting, which has radio stations from, Northern Ontario to Nova Scotia, including St. John and Moncton. And so that's my current role. It's still, Dave, a big passion is still Huddle, as you know, and business development in the Maritimes. So that one's still very close to my heart. So Huddle, for people who don't know it, is a maritime publication just about business news in the Maritimes. It started in New Brunswick in 2015, and in the beginning of the pandemic, we launched in Nova Scotia in Halifax. It turned out to be, we didn't know at the time. We actually launched it in Halifax pre-pandemic, and then the pandemic hit. And obviously that's difficult, as everybody would. I'm sure you've had these discussions about the pandemic and its impact on business and entrepreneurs. It was both a difficult thing and a good thing for us, because people were so hungry for news, business and otherwise in the pandemic, and so much news during the pandemic centered around business and the economy and trying to keep it going, and then, restarting it coming out of the pandemic, that we were actually able to grow readership in Halifax fairly quickly as a result. But yeah, so it's basically a daily business news magazine for the Maritimes online. And then we also do, what Dave referred to, a Saturday newsletter column called the Saturday Huddle. And it started with me kind of sharing my reflections on business news every Saturday, and it's grown into including other reporters on the team, because my take, Dave, was people just got tired of my voice. I had to bring in new ones too.
Not that I don't enjoy the other ones, but I really enjoyed your Saturday thoughts, and probably because I know you, it helps. But I just found them really. I find them very interesting and just a nice way to get your weekend going on a Saturday. So, and for people that aren't from Atlantic Canada, we're talking about Atlantic Canada, we're talking about the Maritimes, and we're talking about Eastern Canada, some of the provinces in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. But I think what Huddle does would be relevant really anywhere, wouldn't it?
I think so, yeah. I mean, and we cover New Brunswick and Nova Scotia with obviously, wider ambitions of being in Atlantic Canada and then maybe beyond that. We do a podcast that's Atlantic wide. That's called Insights. It's hosted by David Campbell, an economist, and Don Mills, who used to ran a long-term a polling firm out of Halifax. And they actually do, and theirs is Atlantic wide. But no, absolutely, Dave, because we cover basically what Huddle tries to do is cover business at kind of the main street level. It's not report on business. It's not your traditional business section in a newspaper. We try to tell the stories of entrepreneurs at street level. And that could be a tech firm. It could be a restaurant owner. It could be a coffee shop. It could be somebody, constructing a new, apartment building development downtown that everybody's keeping their eye on. And it's meant to spotlight growth in all of its forms, in our communities. And when Acadia acquired Huddle, and I found out, all these radio stations from northwestern Ontario to Nova Scotia were situated in mainly small communities, and then cities like Thunder Bay, Ontario, right? And Halifax, of course. Those people in those communities don't focus on business news in their daily news outlets, right? So I was immediately thinking Huddle, Thunder Bay. Right. And I went to Thunder Bay and visited it. It's a beautiful city right on Lake Superior, but with all those kinds of same characteristics as there are in maritime communities, right? Like growing downtowns and, struggles over, developing labor force and growing companies. And a lot of people feel alienated by business news because they think of stock tables and report on business. And what we try to do is, as I said before, bring business to that street level, and you could do that in any community across the country or North America for that matter.
Where did this interest start for you, Mark? Of were you always interested in wanting to pursue sharing business news, or were you put into that role? How did that all start?
It's a really good question. For me, I mean, I'm a storyteller and also, Emily, I'm an entrepreneur by background. So to go back, 20 or so years in my career, which is actually where I first met Dave. When I was in my early 30s, we started a newspaper in St. John called Here. And it was a weekly, alternative newspaper, at the time. And I had been working for the Telegraph Journal, the Daily. And I left to join a group of people to start my own paper. So I became very entrepreneurial from that point. I've always thought of myself as a journalist, but a very entrepreneurial-minded journalist. And that's been a bug that I've had for 20 or so years. And when we were building Here, which we eventually expanded into Moncton before selling the paper, we did a lot of the kind of news that we do in Huddle now. We just gravitated towards covering growth and change in all of its forms, right? And that's cultural, it's artistic, it's about our lifestyles, but you can't escape business. It's about business, and because business is really that face on the community, on its values, whether it's what's important to its economy. So, fast forward 20 years, I'd been with another startup just before Huddle called Civilized, and it was actually a cannabis culture publication that was kind of a hybrid California St. John business. I joined Huddle from there, and I was really excited. I was approached by Alan Gates, who was the entrepreneur who started it. And in a lot of ways, it was coming full circle to me because it really resembled a lot Here, the paper I'd operated 20 years ago, because it was really just meant to be about, street level growth and change.
It's I'm glad great question, Emily, because I'm glad you brought up Here. I was actually, if I could find it, I graced the cover once, and the title was David and Goliath, and it was the story about a business I was a partner in, and how we use this small business, how we use some of these bigger businesses to get into other regions, and it was really helpful because the Here magazine, for someone who is new to the region, it really supported giving me a bit of profile locally, and I was always very thankful for that, Mark, and I miss that. I miss that publication.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah, and that's a really good example, Dave, because we would have gravitated even back then to, spotlighting entrepreneurs and new businesses. And, going back to your original question, I think we need more of that, like in all of our communities. Journalists, they tend to shy away from business journalism because it's seen by a lot of journalists to be promotional, right? I'm not going to say not real journalism, but it feels to them more like advertising. And so it tends to get buried in newspapers, to use an old fashioned term, because I know most of us are digital and online now and doing podcasts. But I never really felt that way. I always felt like there is a hunger for covering the work of entrepreneurs and business leaders. And one of the things I learned when I first took on Huddle was I'd never worked much with Google Analytics and sort of measuring, page views and users and trying to measure your audience. And I had this instinct when I joined Huddle that it was somewhat Main Street, but I turned it more Main Street when I got there. Borrowing a friend's term, because she actually called it Main Street journalism, was what she's referred to it as. And the page view growth was astonishing. Once we started to really get into these communities and cover the growth of their small businesses. And it, taught me something about how hungry communities are to, it's not just the entrepreneurial class and business owners that care. It's everyday people are just watching for any signs of growth that gives them, optimism about their communities. Mm. And going back to that original question, David, something that's universal.
Yeah.
Something we should do more of, quite honestly.
Yeah, I really like that about the sharing, that it does create optimism for other people. And, I think even I recently read your article about the local restaurant owner who's paying his employees more than minimum wage. And even I think sharing that story, sharing how he's not having a problem with employee retention at a time where a lot of people are, and giving new ideas to people, new insights to people, new ways of possibly approaching a situation. And I think how that could be seen in some ways as like promoting a company. I kind of want to check out that restaurant now, but also, giving ideas about how businesses can be managed and how employees can be treated.
Right. Yeah. And then when I was thinking about, leadership and how we've kind of on kind of the pages of Huddle kind of, talked about that issue, explored that issue. That's a really great example, Emily, of like a Main Street business, a restaurant. It's a restaurant called Rocket Burger in Fredericton. And, we're having these discussions on minimum wage and how high should it be. And in a story meeting, I just said to one of the reporters, can you start finding us some businesses that are already doing it? And the impact that it's having on those businesses. And the reporter came back with that piece, Jessie Saulnier, actually, she's an intern with Huddle. And what I found really inspiring about reading about that piece is we get a little bit nervous about, because wages are cost of business, right? And it's been a discussion in our region about how do we, raise wages and make working conditions better for people. And what I loved about that particular story is that it was all positive for him. He actually did it before the pandemic, and he saw immediate results with retention and employee satisfaction. And he actually went to a 4-day work week as well. And in hospitality, it's tough business, right? It's like the profit margins are low and it's hard work and there's a lot of turnover, and restaurants really struggled through the pandemic, and hopefully they're starting to come out of it. I think they are. But again, going to leadership and discussions of leadership, that owner just took it upon himself to make a decision to raise those wages, and it paid off from a business point of view and from an employee satisfaction. So it was kind of a win-win. So those types of stories that we like to spotlight.
Yeah, and they're doing things differently.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and I read that as well, and I saw with tips and stuff, they're making over $20 an hour, right? So what I really appreciated is while you're telling great story. I mean, so one is with Here and then now Huddle, the entrepreneur in me really appreciates the spotlight you put on the small businesses like my own and others, which is, so helpful because, I didn't know about Rocket Burger before. Now I do. And like Emily, I kind of want to source it out. And who doesn't like a good burger, especially if, when you appreciate the values that are behind the restaurant. So from a leadership perspective, and I think you guys are leading as well, Mark, in not shying away from controversy. And you spoke, or wrote, I should say, pretty openly about, and you gotta remember, like, if we go back, like, I don't know how much, maybe 18 months ago, we're right in the thick of this pandemic. And you had one of the pieces I read, and I don't want to misquote you, but it was just really questioning some of the logic behind how we were shutting things down and the vaccination mandates and all these kind of things. And I remember at the time thinking, wow, that's bold, because there could, and I don't know if there was, but there could be a big backlash because people were just, it was like kind of like a dogfight at that point because people were so polarized. And I would think of you as kind of a liberally minded person, but you were willing to take a stance and ask some questions, and in a way that I found very courageous, especially given the times.
Yeah, and I think when I think back to that time too, and for us, it's about creating conversations, because obviously we're all not experts, we're journalists, we're business leaders, but we have a role in the conversation, especially as it kind of impacts us and impacts our communities. And in particular, Dave, around that time, I remember New Brunswick entrepreneurs David Alston and Marcel Lebrun, very well-known leaders here in New Brunswick, both as entrepreneurs, but also as social entrepreneurs. And they had come to me with the idea of co-writing a couple of pieces on how to safely and intelligently reopen the economy. And I ended up writing myself out of that. And so we gave David and Marcel that platform, and I ended up doing a podcast conversation with them. And at the time, when I look back, it was quite provocative because they were trying to chart a course for reopening when everybody in the province was still feeling very nervous and very upset about the pandemic and trying to cope with it. So talking about reopening so soon challenged a lot of people. They were very thoughtful pieces that those guys wrote. And they're actually still to this day are the most popular stories all time for Huddle that David and Marcel wrote. And for me, to your point, David, what it said to me was that people they just want to have the conversation. They want to have the debate, right? We do, and they want to be challenged. And those were two great examples of that. Because with us, and we have this conversation at Huddle all the time. Our tagline is business is good. And I kind of play with that and call it business does good too often. And because I think a lot about the role that media and business have in making our community stronger. But there's often a misunderstanding. Every once in a while, we'll have articles that challenge people or critique, policies or things that businesses are doing. And people say, well, aren't you business is good? And we are. But we're also business does good. And we all need to challenge ourselves, as leaders in the community, and that's business and political, to do better. And so that's kind of where I see the place for debates like that. And we also, another recent example is we had a series of stories and columns on inflation and grocery store prices. And one of our journalists wrote quite a biting column about some comments that the head of Sobeys had made about, leave us alone, we're doing our best. Inflation isn't our fault. And yet we have people going into grocery stores paying very high prices, and we have grocery companies that are making big profits, right? And anyway, the reporter ended up doing a nice column that was quite pointed and quite sharp. And it was one of the Saturday pieces, David. And but he turned it a little bit on its head because he kind of promoted the idea of shopping local, meaning shopping small, right? So we have their large grocery stores, the Sobeys, the superstores. But we also have your small corner grocer that a lot of us go to, and we try to promote. So yeah. So anyway, just that's a long-winded answer, Dave. But I think it's all about just exploring the issues and promoting the companies that's important.
And not being shy of asking tough questions, right? Which is your journalism, and that's important because it's otherwise, it's seen as maybe little puff pieces, right? So for me personally, I appreciate that, and even if I'm not sure what I think about it, it's nice to hear it coming from someone who's thought through it. And I did read that Saturday piece from I think it's your one of your reporters out of Halifax, I believe.
Yeah, it was Derek Montague from Halifax, and
we should.
He's a good old Newfoundland storyteller, and he's not shy with his opinions.
Yeah, that's what you need. Yeah. So I'm just gonna. I know Emily's probably got a couple great questions. But I wanted to ask about, like you mentioned the podcast, and what I've also been really intrigued by is you and your colleagues, if I think of David Campbell and Don, get to interview some really high profile folks from our region, and you've accessed that. And I'm just wondering from your perspective, like, and this could be a high profile person, or it could be, a small, a corner shop, but like, who's really inspiring you these days in terms of how they're showing up, a leader from Atlantic Canada?
Well, I think for me, and this is why I love the podcast format, because it allows me and it allows David and Don in particular to have conversations with leaders in the region. And I always look for, and I know Don and David do too, they recently did a series of interviews on companies in the region that are working on, net zero businesses, right? Like developing, hydrogen fuel and tidal power and wind farms. So really digging in and seeing who are the progressive companies that are really pushing things forward in that regard in the region. And it's a region that's traditionally reliant on traditional industries, right? So they've explored conversations with CEOs from those companies. And they've also had conversations, that very rare conversations, with people like Jim Irving from JD Irving Limited, that very rarely gives interviews, let alone hour-long ones. And and those are very inspiring chats, because we're used to just hearing those guys in short news clips, right? And it's usually around controversial stories. Mm-hmm. Just so to hear those long-form explorations of how they're dealing with labor force challenges and building companies in high inflation environments are just really, really inspiring. From my point of view, I look for the conversations that have that intersection between entrepreneurship and the social. I tend to gravitate to them. So like in the spring, I interviewed Debbie Rathwell in St. John, who, as part of her consultancy and her business, does event planning, and she kind of lent that expertise to building something that actually exists in communities across the country. It's 100 Women Who Care, St. John, but there are 100 Women Who Care, Halifax. They exist around North America, and there are also 100 Men Who Care organizations, one of which I was part of in St. John. So I had a long-form conversation with her about her inspirations as an entrepreneur and what led her to start that organization, where they've raised nearly $1 million in St. John for community organizations. And I know, Dave, you've been involved in similar organizations and efforts yourself. I did a long podcast interview with Marcel Lebrun, who's former Radian 6 entrepreneur, who helped build a tech company that sold for $500 million in the region. And he turned his attention to social entrepreneurship and has started a tiny home project in Fredericton, helping marginalized people have safe roofs over their head, like dry roofs. Sorry, Dave. I started to ramble there. And the whole point being is that you're housing people who are marginalized and homeless, and then helping them rebuild their lives, whether it's through work or addressing addictions. But here we're talking about somebody like Marcel Lebrun, who's created one of the most successful companies in maritime history, turning his attention towards social entrepreneurship. So those are the kinds of stories, Emily and Dave, that kind of inspire me, and I seek those interviews because I like to be inspired by those people, and I like to share their stories.
Yeah, we're actually having Marcel on the podcast next.
Very good choice. I hope he is not right after me. Actually, no, I don't want him to be before me.
Yeah. That's a funny story there. I was asked to speak after a very high-profile speaker, and I remember feeling very nervous about it. And it was Robin Sharma, and I was surprised that I was asked, and the whole, it was 500 people showing up, and I remember phoning my father and saying, "Dad, like, oh my gosh, how do I get myself in this? How do I get myself out of this? Like this is." He said, "Well, it'll be, just don't speak after him." And then of course they see the agenda: Robin Sharma, leader without a title, best-selling author, da 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 da, and right behind Dave Vale, executive coach. And I was just like, "Oh my God!" So I hear what you're saying, but I'm certain that won't be an issue.
And then from an economy point of view, and I know a lot of this is really obvious. Like some of these figures are obviously people we know of, and then others that are well known. Like I find people like Frank McKenna incredibly inspiring. Somebody who hasn't been Premier of New Brunswick for 25 years, but still like gives a great deal of attention to how to grow the maritime economy from where he sits at the TD Bank. And I was at an event in May. He convenes, it had to be 150 really high profile New Brunswick entrepreneurs. And, the conversations were all around how to build digital economy. And I find people like that, stay engaged and keep working and leverage their networks and their connections and their ability to convene people. And Frank would be just one example. Really inspiring as well. So it's all about, for me, the social entrepreneurship, but also just, building businesses that help people earn a living and create wealth and create opportunity. And the other big one too is, and I mentioned it with Dave, is I really, with Dave Campbell and Don Mills, I'm really intrigued by the companies in the region that are environmentally minded, and knowing we need to get to net zero, what are the businesses that we can scale, and the small businesses that will get us there. Right? So I find that inspiring too.
Yeah. And, hearing you speak of the businesses do good, or how you changed it to the businesses does good, and that behind every business is a person and is a leader, and speaking about those qualities in each people that then helps to create the business, and whether that is a social enterprise business or whatever kind that is. And yeah, even hearing your reference to Frank McKenna and what he is doing as a person outside of no longer being the Premier, that is impacting the community. And so when you think of some of those, those qualities or skill sets that you would see in these leaders, what are some of the highest qualities that kind of stand out to you that you would like to see other businesses, other leaders draw more from?
I think one of the most important ones for me is really being open to change. I think of workplaces and leaders that have operated in a traditional setting, a 9-to-5 work environment, that suddenly need to accommodate people who have different needs, right? They might need to work from home because they have young kids, right? They might need more flexibility. And so for me, it's leaders showing the ability to change and to be open to what their people need, people that work for them. And I think of my own example too, because Huddle, we just kind of started as kind of we really were an organic kind of growth oriented business where, employees got to sort of chart their own paths, right? We could work from home, we could work from a cafe, we could work from the office, we could work at midnight, we could work at 6 a.m. It was really about getting the work done. That was the most important thing. And so the founders of the company were very flexible about allowing us to figure out what was right for us. And then I joined Acadia, and Acadia acquired Huddle. And one of the first things a senior executive said to me was, you don't have to conform to the way we work, because, Acadia was still it's an evolving company, but it's still very traditional in a lot of ways. And it is an office environment where people, for the most part, come into the office. So obviously that's changed over the last 2 years, and the company's evolving. But that was a big statement to me, that they just said, don't change anything. If you're happy working from home, don't worry if you're not in the office at 8:30 a.m. And I think so. And to me, that's leadership, right? That's recognizing. And I know for a lot of companies, it's a mix of pragmatism and values. There's both, right? Companies are learning that you need to respond to employee needs and be flexible. Another example of leadership is to embrace change in the Maritimes has meant changing a lot of traditional attitudes on immigration, and people coming into New Brunswick and into Atlantic Canada contribute great things to our communities, contribute great things to our workplaces. But having leaders stand up and share those values and live those values, I think, is really important in companies. And I think of one interview that David Campbell and Don Mills did with Jim Irvin, and they pressed him a lot on, because here you have this like huge New Brunswick company that is going to be losing people to retirement. It's people are moving on to other jobs. There's a constant regeneration. Thousands of employees that work in those various companies, and they've adopted very progressive attitudes towards immigration and finding a place for new Canadians in their workplace. And he spoke about it in a way that he believed it, and he was living those values, right? Not, I need people in my mills, I need people in my businesses. It's like they need to become part of the communities. And in New Brunswick, the mills are in very small towns, and they have a head office in St. John. And it was the same thing. We interviewed, David and Don interviewed, I think I'm going to get his name right, John Bragg from Oxford, the blueberry, the conglomerate that ships blueberries around the world, billion-dollar companies. And even in small towns like that, right, they've had to change the way they do things to meet those workforce needs and respond to people's changing needs. And so even in small companies like that, you're finding, in some cases, billionaires that are, 70 plus, right, years old, willing to change.
Yeah.
And see things. And I'm not saying that they weren't progressive before, but really showing it in terms of how they're shaping the future of their companies. I know that's a long-winded answer, Emily, but those are kinds of the signs of leadership that I look for. And anywhere from J.D. Irving to the guy running a burger shop in Fredericton, it's all the same to me.
Yeah.
And it really is, Mark, and I can say that because I've known you for years, is that you don't discriminate that way at all. You show it. One of the things I really admire about you is you show an equal interest in whoever that entrepreneur, that leader is, and that's a great trait, because and Huddle's an example of it. Like, it's sprinkled with all sorts of folks and I find that personally, I really enjoy hearing a variety of voices, because sometimes, like, I think of traditional media, would typically hear from one. I mean, and actually, you were kind enough to edit a few of my columns back in the day when I was doing Leadership Unleashed, and that was part of my goal, was because I was meeting people and I was like, wow, like, that's amazing. You live in Rishabuktu and you're doing this, like, and how come I haven't heard of you? I was like shocked, because this is there's only 750 or 800,000 people that live in this province, but how could someone just an hour away be doing something, having this incredible business that I have heard nothing about, right? And then I'll ask someone in the next town and they haven't heard of them either. And I thought, that was just my way of just learning, to be honest with you, and kind of getting the landscape. But I think, Huddle's done it to such a much bigger kind of extent, and it's remarkable. to talk about, people that are billionaires, but also the people that are getting their business off the ground, So,
and Dave, that's a really good example too, because that particular column that you're referring to that you did, like that really livened up those Telegraph pages, right? Because you were giving spotlight to entrepreneurs and having really thoughtful, interesting conversations with them. And now it's in podcast form, right? And it's a whole different world. I really enjoy the podcast because I find it's one of the places where I'm listening to the more thoughtful conversations. I'm still a big reader, but I learn a lot through these kinds of conversations that people have.
Yeah. Well, and given that we're kind of at the end here, unfortunately, I think we could go longer.
Sorry, Dave.
Oh, this is great. This is great. But for people and we will do some takeaways, I think, right, Emily?
Yeah.
Yeah. But before we do that, just people that want to reach out to you, Mark, your heart, you got, I feel like you have a really, like, your inbox is pretty full. So it's probably, so if people are patient, they'll hear back from you. I'm confident. But you got, but if people did want to touch base with you or want to learn more about you, where do they do that, Mark?
Well, people can reach me through Huddle through my email address, which is Leger, Leger, .mark, MARK, @huddle.today. And so that's the best way to reach me. And people can always find me too I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, somewhat active on Twitter, also Instagram. But LinkedIn is probably another great place to reach me.
Okay.
And on Strava too. You knew what I was thinking.
Mark's going to run an ultra marathon now. I can see it.
I have to. You too,
Yeah.
Dave. We're committing ourselves to this. You and I both will do it.
Oh yeah. I'll be in the golf cart beside you, encouraging you to. Isn't that what they do when they support?
Sure. That's sure.
Maybe not. Maybe it's running alongside. So yeah, takeaways. What are you taking away from this conversation, Emma?
I think the one that really stands out the most to me is around the being open to change, and I think that is one thing that the pandemic has just kind of put in our faces that we can't ignore, is that change is the only constant. And whether that's in leadership, whether that's professionally, personally, change is always happening and it's always inevitable. And it's like, we kind of spoke earlier about the ultra and the breaking it up into chapters, and each chapter is a different story. Each chapter is change. And that's the way that we're kind of navigating in life. And this was really encouraging speaking to you, Mark, and in hearing, your interest in sharing stories to create, I think, a better community and a better leader or leaders. I look forward to seeing what you get up to on Strava and seeing you maybe even on the trails. Speaking of being open to change.
Yes. Well, I'll tell you, I see Mark on the roads all the time. I'm driving, he's running, but that's maybe that'll change for me. A takeaway for me is I really like, and you've always done this, but how your stories and Huddle stories and podcasts really humanize people, right? Like you mentioned Jim Irving as an example. And I think sometimes when you're a small region, people have an ability to talk about someone as if they're not a real person. Right, because they may be, be seen as very powerful and have, which in this case he is, and others, or Frank McKenna, whoever. But to humanize them and to that they have enough trust in you and your colleagues to actually have a long form conversation, and I appreciate you doing that with us today, Mark. It's been great, and it's amazing how quickly an hour flies by. What I would encourage, Emily, when you're in St. John or Mark, when you're in Fredericton, definitely go out for a coffee together. But what you'll find is, like, every time I'll sit down with Mark for a coffee, and it's been a while since we've done this, but it generally turns like I'm like in my head, it's going to be an hour, and then I'm looking and I'm like, geez, it's been an hour and 20 minutes. And there's still more I want to talk about. So you have that quality about him, or you just want to talk more, kind of like we're doing today. But thank you so much, Mark, for coming on the podcast finally, and keep up the great work, man.
Yeah, no, thank you, and I appreciate it. Admire the work you're doing, and these conversations that you're having with people are such a gift, right? because you mentioned Jim Irving, but it's with all of our leaders being able to sit people down and actually have that conversation that does, I like the way you say, humanize them. Because you don't get that in just daily news coverage of issues, right? It really takes the kind of conversations that Emily, you and Dave have, and the ones we have at Huddle, to really give people the opportunity to share their thoughts and share how they feel about how the economy and our communities are evolving. So thank you for doing this.
Awesome. Well, Geneviève's going to give us the outtake, right, Geneviève? Or unless Emily wants to do it.
Geneviève has that dialed.
You and I both don't want to do that.
My outtake might take another 20 minutes.
We do also have to say a big thank you to Mark and Huddle, because they have in the past shared Boiling Point conversations. So we appreciate that, so that more people can hear these conversations. And if you'd like to find our conversations, they are on boilingpointpodcast.com. We also are active on social media across LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. And we post the video versions on YouTube and Facebook.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, Mark. We'll chat soon.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Thanks for listening to the Boiling Point Podcast. Remember to subscribe and rate our podcasts on your favorite listening platform. To find out more, head to our website at boilingpointpodcast.com. You can connect with us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. To find out more about Dave Vale's work, head over to visioncoachinginc.com. Thanks for listening, and make sure to check out our next conversation.